In 2019, Lebanese citizens woke up to find their bank accounts frozen, not hacked, not stolen. It's frozen by the banks themselves. Withdrawal limits were imposed overnight. The Lebanese pound, which had been pegged to the dollar at 1,500 to 1 for over 2 decades, began collapsing. By 2023, it had lost over 95% of its value. A doctor's life savings became worthless. A retiree's pension couldn't buy groceries. The middle class was wiped out in months. This wasn't a natural disaster or a war. This was a financial system doing exactly what it was designed to do: extract wealth from ordinary citizens and transfer it to a corrupt elite. Lebanon's collapse wasn't an accident. It was inevitable. If you understand how it happened, you'll recognize the warning signs appearing in financial systems around the world right now. The foundation of Lebanon's crisis was built on a lie that many countries tell themselves: that you can peg your currency to the dollar indefinitely without the economic fundamentals to support it. For over 20 years, Lebanon's central bank maintained a fixed exchange rate of 1,500 pounds to $1. This created an illusion of stability. People believed their savings were as good as dollars. Banks offered incredibly high interest rates on pound deposits, sometimes 15 or 20%, because they needed to attract capital to maintain the peg. It seemed too good to be true. It was here-est how the scam worked. Lebanese banks would take deposits in pounds and lend to the government, which was running massive deficits. The government couldn't afford to pay the interest rates the banks promised, so the central bank stepped in with a scheme that can only be described as a Ponzi structure. The central bank would borrow dollars from commercial banks at high interest rates, then use those dollars to maintain the currency peg. The banks would use the interest payments to pay their depositors. New deposits funded old obligations. As long as money kept flowing in, the system held together. But the moment inflows stopped, the entire structure was designed to collapse. And the inflows did stop. Lebanon imports far more than it exports. The country produces little, consumes much, and covers the gap with remittances from Lebanese working abroad and with foreign deposits attracted by high interest rates. When regional instability increased, when confidence began to waver, when depositors started pulling money out instead of putting money in, the system had no foundation to fall back on. The reserves were gone. The central bank had been using new deposits to pay old depositors. When that stopped working, they simply froze the accounts. What happened next reveals the true nature of the system. Capital controls were imposed. Ordinary citizens couldn't access their savings. But the elite had already moved their money out. Politicians, bankers, wealthy businessmen, they saw the collapse coming and transferred their wealth abroad. By the time ordinary Lebanese realized what was happening, the exit was closed. The people who built and profited from the system escaped. The currency collapse followed with mathematical inevitability. Without the central bank able to maintain the peg, the pound's real value emerged. And that real value was a fraction of what people had believed. The black market exchange rate soared to 50,000, then 100,000, then beyond. Overnight, people discovered their salaries were worth pennies. A teacher making what seemed like a decent wage found herself unable to afford bread. Doctors couldn't pay rent. The entire middle class fell into poverty in months. This is what makes Lebanon's crisis so instructive. It shows how quickly a currency can collapse when the underlying system is fraudulent. For years, everything seemed fine. People went to work, bought groceries, saved money, planned for retirement. The banks were open, the ATMs worked, life was normal. And then, in weeks, it all evaporated. The stability was an illusion maintained by constant inflows of new money. When those inflows stopped, reality asserted itself with brutal speed. The human cost is where the abstraction becomes visceral. Families that had saved for decades to buy homes found their down payments worthless. Retirees who had worked their entire lives discovered their pensions could unbuy a week's worth of food. Students who had saved for education abroad watched their tuition money disappear. These weren't foolish people making bad decisions. These were ordinary citizens trusting a system that their government, their banks, and their central bank all insisted was stable. They were lied to systemically, and they paid the price. The political structure made this inevitable. Lebanon's government operates on a sectarian power-sharing system that effectively guarantees corruption and dysfunction. Positions are allocated by religious sect, creating a system where loyalty is to sectarian leaders rather than to the nation. Those leaders used the banking system as a personal piggy bank, borrowing endlessly to fund patronage networks and enrich themselves. The central bank enabled this by creating mechanisms to hide the insolvency. Everyone with power benefited from the system continuing. No one with power had an incentive to fix it. So it continued until it couldn't. This is the lesson that extends beyond Lebanon. When a financial system serves the elite rather than the public, when short-term political incentives override long-term stability, when everyone in power benefits from hiding problems rather than solving them, collapse is not a possibility. It's a certainty. The only question is timing. What makes Lebanon particularly relevant right now is how modern and developed it seemed before the collapse. This wasn't a primitive economy. Lebanon had sophisticated banks, an educated population, integration into global financial markets. Beirut was considered the Paris of the Middle East. People lived comfortable, Western-style lives. And then it all fell apart. The lesson is that sophistication doesn't protect you from fundamental unsustainability. Ponzi scheme doesn't become stable just because it's run through modern banks with computer systems. For observers in other countries, the parallels should be uncomfortable. How many developed nations are running unsustainable deficits funded by central bank interventions? How many are using new debt to pay old obligations? How many have elites who would see a crisis coming and escape while ordinary citizens are trapped? The specific mechanisms differ, but the fundamental dynamics are similar. Lebanon is a warning about what happens when monetary and political dysfunction combine. The recovery, or lack thereof, is equally instructive. Years after the initial crisis, Lebanon still hasn't stabilized. The pound continues to fluctuate wildly. Banks remain largely closed to ordinary depositors. There's been no bailout, no restructuring, no accountability. The system failed, the people suffered, and the elite moved on. This is what collapse actually looks like. It's not a dramatic moment followed by rebuilding. It's grinding poverty and dysfunction that persists for years. For individuals, Lebanon teaches several critical lessons. First, bank deposits are not the same as ownership. When you put money in a bank, you're lending to that institution. If it fails, or if the government imposes capital controls, your money can disappear. Second, currency pegs maintained artificially are dangerous. If a country doesn't have the economic fundamentals to support its exchange rate, the peg will eventually break, and when it does, savings evaporate. Third, high interest rates are often a warning sign, not an opportunity. If rates seem too good to be true, it's usually because institutions are desperately trying to attract capital to cover existing obligations. Most importantly, Lebanon shows that collapse can happen in modern, developed economies, not just distant or primitive ones. The proximity to normal life makes it more dangerous because people don't see it coming. Everything seems fine until the day it isn't. By the time the crisis is obvious to everyone, the opportunity to protect yourself has passed. The Lebanese people trusted their system. They trusted their banks, their central bank, their currency peg, their government's assurances. Every single one of those institutions failed them. The system was designed not to serve the public, but to enrich the elite. And when it collapsed, the elite escaped with their wealth intact, while ordinary citizens lost everything. This is the blueprint of financial collapse in the modern era. Not external invasion, not natural disaster, but internal corruption and monetary dysfunction hidden behind sophisticated institutions and official assurances. Lebanon executed this blueprint perfectly. The question is how many other countries are following the same script, and whether citizens will recognize it before their own accounts are frozen. If this opened your eyes to how quickly stability can disappear, subscribe. Lebanon's crisis isn't over, and it's not unique. The warning signs are everywhere. The only question is whether you're reading them.